There are moments in history when silence is not an option, when the world stage demands a voice, not a whisper, not a compromise, but a voice that carries the dignity of a nation and the strength of its people. And in this moment, that voice came from India, from the calm, steady, yet unshakable words of Dr. S. Jaishankar. His message to the world, and especially to President Trump, was not just about oil, not just about tariffs. It was about respect, about sovereignty, about India refusing to be told how to breathe, how to trade, and how to rise. A tariff is not just a number on paper. It is not merely a tax, not simply a policy crafted in some office thousands of miles away. A tariff, when imposed with arrogance, is an attempt to dictate. It is a subtle way of saying, we control the rules, and you will follow them. It is a message wrapped in the language of economics, but beneath it lies the shadow of power politics. And that is why when the United States under President Trump chose to weaponize tariffs, especially targeting nations like India over issues such as Russian oil, it wasn't just about trade. It was about control. It was about influence. It was about testing how far a nation could be pushed before it would push back. But here's where the story changes. India has known shackles before. India has lived through centuries when foreign powers tried to dictate what it could grow, what it could buy, and how it could live. And because of that history, India knows the sound of chains. India knows the weight of being told what it can and cannot do. Yet, India also knows something far more powerful, that those chains may rattle, but they will not bind a nation that has already tasted freedom and vowed never to surrender it again. So, when Dr. S. Jaishankar stood before the world and delivered India's position, he was not merely rejecting tariffs. He was rejecting the idea that another nation could hold the pen to write India's future. He reminded the world, in words calm but cutting, that India's choices are India's alone, that sovereignty is not negotiable, that dignity is not up for sale, and that courage cannot be taxed. Think of it this way: a tariff tries to create pressure, tries to make another country hesitate before making decisions. But Jaishankar's response flipped that script entirely. Instead of hesitation, there was clarity. Instead of compromise, there was confidence. He said, in essence, that India will always choose what is best for its people, not what is comfortable for someone else's politics. That single statement is not just resistance, it is leadership. Because true leadership is not when you follow rules imposed on you, but when you set your own compass and move forward regardless of storms. This is why his words resonated so deeply. They weren't about oil alone. They weren't even just about tariffs. They were about identity. About saying that India, with its billion voices and its rising power, cannot and will not be shackled by policies designed in another capital. India will listen, India will engage, but India will never surrender its right to decide. And that is a lesson the world is beginning to understand, that chains may be forged in boardrooms, but they break in the presence of courage. Jaishankar reminded us that India does not bend, India decides. And when India decides, the world must listen. Yes, the world talks about Russian oil. It has become the subject of debates in parliaments, negotiations in global forums, and arguments across television screens. To some, it is simply a commodity, barrels measured, priced, and shipped. To others, it is leverage, a tool to control who buys, who sells, and under what terms. But when Dr. S. Jaishankar addressed the issue, he lifted the conversation out of the narrow corridors of economics and into the broader halls of dignity. Because for India, this was never only about oil. This was about the principle of choice, the sovereignty of decision-making, and the refusal to allow another power to dictate what fuels its progress. Oil is important, yes. It keeps factories running, cars moving, homes warm, and cities alive. But as Jaishankar reminded the world, oil is not the essence of a nation. The true essence of a nation lies in its dignity, because when the lights dim, they can be turned on again. When prices rise, economies adjust. But when dignity is compromised, something far deeper is lost, the very soul of independence. And no nation that values its sovereignty can allow that to happen. That is why, when India faced criticism for continuing to purchase Russian oil despite Western pressure, Jaishankar's response was not defensive. It was confident, almost serene, as though he was reminding everyone of a truth they had forgotten. He said, in effect, that India would buy energy from wherever it needed to. in whatever way best served its people. And if someone had a problem with that, the problem did not lie with India. The problem lay with those who thought they had the right to lecture a sovereign nation on how to secure its future. Dollars and discounts may drive the conversation in financial circles, but for India, the larger calculation was about dignity. Because what message would it send to the world if India, a rising power, bowed down to external pressure and gave up its independent choices? It would not only affect oil, it would set a precedent that India's decisions could be manipulated at will. That is why this was never just about barrels of crude. It was about ensuring that India's voice is not drowned out by louder nations. It was about showing that in a world of competing interests, India's interest would always come first. The beauty of Jaishankar's stance is that it was not aggressive, not confrontational. It was steady, almost fatherly in tone, as though he was teaching the world a lesson in respect. Oil, he said in his own way, keeps the lights on. But dignity is what keeps a nation standing tall when the storms of politics and economics come crashing. Without dignity, oil is just fuel. With dignity, oil becomes energy for progress, chosen freely and used proudly. That is why India's dignity cannot be traded, not even for the strongest currency in the world, not even for promises wrapped in gold. Because once dignity is gone, no amount of oil, no amount of dollars can ever buy it back. When Jaishankar looked at the world and said, "India will do what India must," the words carried a weight that went far beyond the policy debate of the moment. They were not loud, they were not shouted, they were not coded in the language of defiance. They were calm, precise, and unwavering, and yet they struck like thunder across the global stage. Because what he offered in that moment was not an argument, it was not even a negotiation, it was a declaration. And declarations, unlike demands, are final. They do not seek approval. They do not ask for permission. They simply state a truth so firmly that the world has no choice but to listen. Respect in international affairs is often misunderstood. Too many nations believe it can be forced through threats, economic pressure, or political intimidation. They mistake fear for respect, but fear fades. Fear breeds resistance. Fear may silence for a moment, but it never creates lasting acknowledgement. Respect, on the other hand, is something deeper. It cannot be extracted. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be demanded. It must be commanded, and the only way to command it is through confidence that does not waver under pressure. That is what Jaishankar embodied when he spoke for India. The phrase, "India will do what India must," was not just about oil, tariffs, or trade. It was about sovereignty in its purest form. It was about reminding the world that India's decisions are made in New Delhi, not in Washington, not in Brussels, not in any other capital. That kind of confidence does not need to raise its voice. It simply asserts itself and lets the clarity of conviction do the work. And in that instant, the world saw that India was not seeking validation. India was setting terms, its own terms, guided by its own priorities. What makes that stance so powerful is its quietness. True strength does not need to shout. True confidence does not need to justify itself with endless explanations. Instead, it radiates from the certainty that a nation knows who it is, what it stands for, and where it is headed. That is why Jaishankar's words commanded respect. He didn't beg for understanding. He didn't argue for sympathy. He simply declared that India's path is India's choice, and that was enough. The dignity of that calm assertion echoed louder than any threat ever could. This moment also revealed something about the changing balance of power in the world. For decades, respect was assumed to flow from the top down, from the most powerful nations outward. Smaller nations were expected to accept, to comply, to follow. But India's rise has altered that equation. By speaking with clarity and confidence, Jaishankar showed that respect now flows differently. It flows to those who stand tall, who do not blink in the face of pressure, and who define themselves on their own terms. In that way, India did not demand respect. India commanded it. And when respect is commanded, it lasts. It shapes how nations are treated, how they are perceived, and how their voices echo in the halls of power. That is what happened in that moment. India commanded the room, and the world had no choice but to listen. The world is no longer the playground of one nation, no longer a stage where one powerful capital writes the script and expects the rest to perform their lines. For too long, Global politics operated under that assumption that the strongest economy, the loudest military, or the wealthiest alliance had the right to define the rules for everyone else. But as Dr. Jaishankar made clear, that era is fading. The 21st century does not belong to one voice or one capital. It belongs to many, and every nation has the right, and indeed the responsibility, to contribute its ink to the writing of global rules. Trade cannot be dictated by a single government's preferences. Energy flows cannot be restricted to satisfy one nation's strategic goals. Cooperation across borders cannot be reduced to the priorities of one or two powers. The world has grown too interconnected, too interdependent for such a narrow view. And this is precisely why India's position is so vital. India insists that if there is to be a global order, it must be truly global. Not dominated, not imposed, not manufactured in isolation, but shaped collectively by all who live within it. When Jaishankar asserted that no nation has the right to dictate India's choices, he was not speaking only for India. He was, in many ways, voicing the unspoken frustration of dozens of countries that often find themselves caught between the pressures of larger powers. His words carried the strength of a truth many recognize, but hesitate to say. The rules of the world cannot be written in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing alone. They must be written in Delhi, in Jakarta, in Pretoria, in Brasilia, and in countless other capitals that make up the diverse reality of our planet. India's firm stance reminds us that equality among nations is not just a principle for speeches. It must be a practice in action. Because when rules are written together, they are respected. When they are written by only one, they are resisted. That is why India's voice matters in shaping the future, and why Jaishankar's clarity struck such a chord. He was not rejecting global rules. He was demanding fair ones. And fair rules can only be created when every nation, big or small, has its say. That is the world India envisions, and that is the world it is determined to help build. Every message Jaishankar delivered was rooted in one undeniable truth: India is not a follower of power. It is a pillar of it. The world may try to test this truth through tariffs, through pressures, through veiled threats and open criticisms, but the foundation of India's rise is too deep to be shaken. This rise is not a matter of convenience. It is not a temporary trend. It is a reality built on centuries of resilience, on decades of progress, and on the unyielding spirit of more than 1 billion people who refuse to be defined by the limitations others set for them. Tariffs may rise. Sanctions may be threatened. Narratives may be spun to cast doubt on India's choices. Yet none of these can halt a nation that has already crossed the threshold from survival to influence. India is no longer merely reacting to global currents. It is shaping them. Whether in technology, pharmaceuticals, space exploration, or diplomacy, India's fingerprints are visible on the future. That is why Jaishankar's tone carried such confidence, because he was not speaking of a distant dream. He was pointing to a present reality, one that the world can no longer deny. The strength of India's rise lies not only in its economy or its military, but in its democracy, in its diversity, and in its determination. Few nations carry the weight of balancing ancient traditions with modern ambitions as India does, and fewer still succeed in turning that balance into an advantage. This rise is not about dominance, it is about contribution. It is about India stepping into its role as a stabilizing force, a voice of reason, and a partner for progress. The world may echo with threats. The corridors of power may buzz with pressure tactics. But none of these can erase the fact that India's rise is woven into the global fabric. To ignore it is to ignore reality. To resist it is to resist the inevitable. Jaishankar's message was therefore more than an assertion. It was a reminder that the world must adapt to this new reality. India's rise is not a favor granted by others. It is not negotiable. It is unstoppable. And in accepting that truth, the world does not lose. It gains a stronger partner, a steadier voice, and a brighter future shaped not by one, but by many. So, what do we take away from Jaishankar's strong message? It wasn't just a reply to tariffs. It was a statement of identity, that India is not here to be instructed. India is here to be respected. And as long as voices like Jaishankar speak for this nation, the world will learn a truth it cannot unhear. India bows to no tariff, no threat, no pressure. India walks forward with pride, with strength, and with destiny on its side.